The dinner reservation was for 2 people, 7 o'clock, under a name that wasn't mine. I found it by accident, scrolling through the shared calendar app we'd installed 2 years earlier so neither of us double-booked school pickups. There it was, wedged between Tyler's dentist appointment and Grace's dance recital, Michelle, dinner, Buchan, 7 p.m. No note about who. No mention to me, not that morning over coffee, not the night before. I sat in my car in the office parking garage for a full minute just looking at it, feeling something cold move through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. My name is Dan Whitmore. I'm 41, I run regional sales for a medical supply company here in Asheville, North Carolina, and at the time all of this started, Michelle and I had been married 12 years, together 14, if you count back to the 2 of us broke and stupid happy in a 1-bedroom apartment near UNC Asheville, back before either of us had real jobs or real furniture or the 2 kids who now ran our lives, Tyler at 10 and Grace at 6. I want to tell you I was a suspicious man by nature. I wasn't. If anything, people who knew me would have called me steady to a fault, the guy who didn't rattle easily, who trusted first and asked questions only if something actually forced the question. That calendar entry was the first thing in 12 years of marriage that forced one. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself there was probably an explanation, a work dinner, a school fundraiser committee thing, something boring and forgettable that I just hadn't been looped into because my brain was always half buried in quarterly numbers. Michelle came home a little after 9, said she'd grabbed dinner with a friend from the PDA, kissed me on the cheek, and went upstairs to check on the kids. I sat in the kitchen a long time after that, turning the phrase over in my head, a friend from the PDA, and finding I couldn't picture a single face to put behind it. I want to be honest about who I was before any of this happened, because it matters for everything that comes after. I loved my wife in the specific, unglamorous way you love someone after over a decade, not the electric version from our 20s, but something steadier, built out of 10,000 small mornings and shared exhaustion and the particular language 2 people build raising kids together. I also, if I'm being fair to myself and to her, hadn't been paying close attention. My job had gotten bigger that year, a promotion, more travel, more hours logged staring at spreadsheets after the kids went to bed. Michelle had mentioned, more than once, that she felt like she was running the house solo. I'd nodded along and meant to do something about it and never quite had. You already know how that sounds, looking back. I didn't, not yet. The person I trusted most outside my marriage was Kevin Marsh. Kevin and I had been best friends since our sophomore year at UNC Asheville, roommates for 2 years, best man in each other's weddings, the kind of friendship where you don't need a reason to call, you just call. Kevin was married to Lisa, a physical therapist, and the 4 of us had spent more Friday nights together than I could count, grilling in someone's backyard, the kids running around while Kevin and I argued about college football and Michelle and Lisa laughed at us from the porch. Kevin had a landscaping business he'd built from nothing, the kind of guy everybody in the neighborhood knew by first name. If you'd asked me, at any point in the last 15 years, to name the one person outside my own family I trusted without a shred of hesitation, I would have said Kevin Marsh without even thinking about it. That's important. Hold on to that. 2 days after the calendar entry, I asked Michelle directly, casual, over dinner, the kids arguing about dessert in the background. Who'd you end up going to Buchan with the other night? She didn't miss a beat, but something in her hand paused for half a second over her fork. Jenny Castellano. From the PTA committee. We were talking about the spring fundraiser. I nodded. I let it go. I had no reason not to. Jenny Castellano was a real person, someone I'd met at school functions, someone who genuinely did sit on the fundraiser committee with Michelle. It was a good answer. It was specific enough to be believable, and I had absolutely no evidence to suggest it wasn't true. I found out 3 weeks later, almost by accident, that Jenny Castellano hadn't been within 100 miles of Buchan that night. She'd been in Charlotte visiting her sister. She mentioned it herself, at pickup, laughing about how she'd missed the whole spring fundraiser conversation because of the trip. I stood in that school pickup line holding my daughter's backpack, and I felt the ground tilt just slightly under me, not enough to fall, not yet, just enough to notice, the way you notice a floor isn't quite level when you set something round on it and watch it roll. I didn't say anything to Michelle that day either. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I've had a long time to think about why. Some of you already know this feeling, the one where some part of you already senses what you're about to find, and delays the finding out for as long as you possibly can, because once you know, you can't go back to not knowing. I wasn't protecting Michelle by staying quiet. I was protecting the version of my life I still, at that point, believed I was living. I didn't know it yet, but the name on that reservation was never going to be the hardest thing I'd learned that year. The hardest thing was still months away, and when it finally arrived, it wasn't going to come from a stranger, or a coworker, or anyone I'd have thought to suspect. It was going to come from someone standing at my own backyard grill, close enough to touch. Life kept moving in the way it does, indifferent to the fact that something in me had already started paying closer attention. Our routine hadn't changed on the surface. Michelle taught second grade at Claxton Elementary, up most mornings by 6:30, out the door by 7:40 with a travel mug and a bag of graded worksheets. I left later, usually around 8:15, after getting Tyler and Grace fed and dressed, since my hours had more flex to them than hers did. Evenings were soccer practice, dance class, dinner around 6:30, homework, bed. It was a full life. It had always felt, to me, like a good one. What I started noticing, once I was actually looking, were the small things I'd have walked right past a month earlier. Michelle had started running errands on Thursday evenings, nothing dramatic, just a standing thing, picking up a few things, usually gone 90 minutes to 2 hours. When I asked once where she'd gone, she said Target, and when I glanced at the bag she brought in, it did have a couple of things from Target in it, dish soap, a few school supplies for her classroom. It checked out. That was the maddening part of all of it, looking back, nothing ever failed to check out completely. Every answer had just enough truth stitched into it to survive a casual question. I want to pause on something here, because it matters for what comes later. Michelle had always kept her phone close, but not obsessively so. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter, let it ring through to voicemail, wasn't the type to guard it. Sometime that spring, that changed. She started carrying it into the bathroom with her. She started keeping it face down on the nightstand, a habit she'd never had before, and if it buzzed at night, her hand found it faster than seemed like an accident. Kevin came around more that spring too, which didn't strike me as strange at the time. If anything, it felt like more of the same. He and Lisa had been going through a rough patch, something about Lisa wanting to expand the physical therapy practice she worked for and Kevin resisting the idea of relocating, and Kevin had taken to showing up at our place on weeknights sometimes, just to decompress, sit on the back porch with a beer, vent about Lisa for 20 minutes and then talk about something else entirely. I liked having him around. Michelle always seemed happy to see him too, more than happy, if I'm honest, in a way I registered at the time as just Michelle being warm, being the kind of person who made everyone in a room feel welcome. She'd laugh harder at Kevin's jokes than she used to. She'd remember small things he mentioned in passing, a client he'd complained about, a knee injury bothering him from an old basketball habit, and bring them up again weeks later, the way you do when you're actually paying close attention to someone. I told myself that was just Michelle being Michelle. She'd always been like that with our friends. The first moment that genuinely snagged, the one I couldn't fully explain away even in the moment, came on a Saturday in April. Kevin, Lisa, Michelle and I had all gone out to dinner together, a rare foursome, the kids at Carol's for the night. At one point, reaching across the table for the bread basket, Kevin's hand brushed Michelle's, and instead of the easy, automatic sorry you'd expect between two people who'd known each other 15 years, there was a half second where neither of them moved, where something passed between them that I couldn't name but felt land somewhere behind my sternum anyway. Lisa didn't seem to notice. I told myself I'd imagined it. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever caught something out of the corner of your eye, something too small to accuse anyone of, too specific to fully dismiss, you already know exactly the position I was in that night. Not sure enough to say anything. Not able to unsee it either. Tyler, of all people, gave me the next piece, though neither of us understood what he was handing me at the time. He'd started calling Kevin Uncle Kevin years earlier, the way kids do with their parents' close friends, and one evening at dinner he mentioned, completely unprompted, that Uncle Kevin had picked him and Grace up from school that Wednesday because Mom had a headache and needed to lie down. I hadn't heard anything about that. Michelle hadn't mentioned it. When I asked her about it later, she said it had slipped her mind, a bad migraine. Kevin happened to be free, it was easier than calling me at work. It was a reasonable explanation. Kevin did have a flexible schedule running his own business. It wasn't strange, on its face, for him to help out. But it was the second time in 2 months that Kevin's name had come up attached to something Michelle hadn't thought to mention to me first, and something about the accumulation, not any single piece, just the growing pile of them, had started keeping me up at night in a way I didn't fully admit to myself yet. I called Steve Okafor, a guy I worked with, someone I trusted enough to say the uncomfortable thing out loud to. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I had a weird feeling about something, and he said the thing that stuck with me for weeks afterward: man, weird feelings don't come from nowhere. You don't have to know what it is yet. You just have to stop telling yourself it's nothing. I didn't stop telling myself it was nothing. Not yet. I went home that night and watched Michelle read Grace a bedtime story, her voice doing all the different character voices the way it always had, and I thought, this is my family. This is real. I am not going to blow it up over a hand brushing a bread basket and a headache that needed a babysitter. I didn't know it yet, but the next sign wasn't going to come from Michelle at all. It was going to come from Lisa, Kevin's wife, in a conversation neither of us planned to have, about something she'd noticed too, and had been carrying alone for even longer than I had. The conversation with Lisa happened by accident, the way most of the important ones in this story did. It was early May, a Tuesday, and I'd stopped by Kevin and Lisa's place to drop off a ladder I'd borrowed for a gutter job. Kevin wasn't home, out on a landscaping site, Lisa said, letting me in while she finished folding laundry in the living room. We talked for a few minutes, the easy small talk you fall into with someone you've known for over a decade, and then Lisa said something that stopped me cold, delivered so casually she clearly had no idea what it would do to me. Has Kevin seemed off to you lately? He's been weird about his phone. Takes calls outside now. Never used to do that. I told her I hadn't noticed anything. It wasn't entirely a lie, I hadn't been watching Kevin the way I'd started watching Michelle. But something in me went very still, standing in that living room with a stranger's version of my own growing unease reflected back at me from a completely different angle. Probably nothing, Lisa said, folding a towel a little too precisely. I just get this feeling sometimes. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I just hadn't said it out loud to anyone yet, not fully, not even to myself. I drove home that day with the windows down, trying to organize the pieces into some shape that made sense and coming up, every time, at the same uncomfortable place, Michelle's Thursday errands. Kevin's phone habits. The bread basket. Tyler's offhand comment about a migraine that never got mentioned to me. None of it, taken alone, meant anything. All of it together had started to look like a shape I didn't want to name. I did something I'm not proud of that week, I checked Michelle's phone while she was in the shower. I found nothing. No suspicious texts, no hidden apps, nothing that looked like evidence of anything at all. I remember the relief that washed through me sitting on the edge of our bed, phone in hand, and how quickly it curdled into something else once I actually thought about it. A clean phone wasn't proof of nothing. It could just as easily be proof that someone had gotten careful. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever gone looking for reassurance and found the absence of evidence instead of the presence of it, you know that particular kind of relief doesn't actually last very long. Michelle's behavior kept shifting in small ways that spring, each one easy enough to explain individually, harder and harder to explain as a set. She started taking longer showers. She started keeping her laptop closed when I walked into a room, something she'd never done before, always leaving it open, half the time not even locked. When I asked her once, lightly, what she was working on, she said report cards, and closed it a little faster than the question warranted. She told me, much later, what was actually happening in her head that spring. This is what she was living through, in her own words. I kept telling myself it would stop. Every single week I told myself this was the last time, that I'd end it before it went any further, that Dan would never have to know because there'd be nothing left to know. But then Kevin would text something small, just checking on me, just something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt seen in years, and I'd cave again. I hated the way I'd started flinching every time Dan walked into a room. I hated that I'd become someone who closed a laptop out of instinct. I told myself I still loved my marriage. I don't think I understood yet that loving something and protecting it aren't always the same thing, and I'd stopped doing the second one a long time before I stopped telling myself I still believed in the first. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, sitting across from her at dinner, watching her close a laptop I had no reason at the time to think meant anything at all. By the middle of May, I'd started keeping a running list in my head, not written down anywhere, just held there, growing heavier by the week. And then Grace, 6 years old, innocent of everything, handed me a piece I couldn't unhear. We were in the car, just the two of us, coming back from her dance class, and she was chattering about her day the way 6-year-olds do, jumping from topic to topic with no warning. "Uncle Kevin's truck was at our house today," she said. "While you were at work. He and Mommy were talking in the kitchen. He left before you got home though." I kept my eyes on the road and my voice as light as I could make it. "Oh yeah? What were they talking about, Bug?" "I don't know. Grown-up stuff. Mommy said not to mention it, 'cause it was a surprise." Grace said it easily, already moving on to something about her dance teacher, weightless the way kids are with things that don't register to them as significant. It registered to me as significant. Mommy said not to mention it. Not it's for your birthday. Not it's a surprise for Daddy. Just, don't mention it. A 6-year-old, coached, however gently, into keeping a secret from her own father. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay next to Michelle in the dark, listening to her breathe, running the whole spring back through my head from the beginning, the calendar entry, Jenny Castellano's alibi that didn't hold, the bread basket, the migraine, Lisa's comment about Kevin's phone, the laptop, and now this, my own daughter, quietly asked to keep a secret about a man who wasn't her father, in her own kitchen, on a weekday afternoon. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand yet, that I hadn't been imagining a pattern out of nothing. I'd been slowly, carefully, being handed the pieces of one, by people who had no idea they were handing them to me at all. I didn't know it yet, lying awake in that dark bedroom, that the truth I was circling wasn't going to be confirmed by anything I found. It was going to be confirmed 3 weeks later, in the worst possible way, by a single photograph I never should have seen, and once I saw it, there wasn't going to be a version of my life that let me unsee it. I started keeping a folder after that night in the car with Grace, not on paper, just on my phone, screenshots and photos and dates, the same instinct that had made me build a career out of tracking numbers now turned, sick and quiet, on my own marriage. The first real piece came from something almost absurdly small. Kevin's landscaping business used a shared invoicing app, and Michelle had, at some point that spring, apparently started helping him with his books, something she mentioned once, breezily, as a favor between friends, Kevin being hopeless with paperwork. I found the app open on our shared iPad by accident one evening, still logged into Kevin's account from whenever she'd last used it, and scrolling through the invoice history out of nothing but idle curiosity, I found a line item that didn't belong there at all, a hotel charge, 3 weeks earlier, under Kevin's business card, categorized as, client meeting, Biltmore Park. I knew Biltmore Park. There was no landscaping client out there Kevin had ever mentioned. There was, however, a boutique hotel. I didn't say anything. I photographed the screen and closed the app. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever found one piece of proof and felt the ground actually move under you, not suspicion anymore, not a feeling, an actual fact sitting in your hand, you know that the moment doesn't feel like relief, even though some part of you had been waiting for exactly this. It feels like falling. I called Steve again that week, and this time I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he said something I've thought about 100 times since. You don't owe her the benefit of the doubt forever, man. At some point collecting more evidence just becomes a way of avoiding the conversation you're scared to have. He was right, and I knew he was right, and I kept collecting evidence anyway for another 2 weeks, because some part of me, the same part that had let the calendar entry go, that had let Jenny Castellano's alibi go, that had let the bread basket go, still wasn't ready to be the man who blew up his own family over what he had. There was a red herring in there too, one that nearly sent the whole thing sideways. Carol, my mother, mentioned during a phone call that she'd seen Michelle's car parked outside a hotel off Tunnel Road one afternoon, the wrong hotel, nowhere near Biltmore Park, and for 2 days I convinced myself Michelle was seeing someone else entirely, someone I hadn't even considered, and spent an ugly, paranoid stretch trying to figure out who. It turned out to be nothing. Michelle had stopped there to use the bathroom on the way back from a doctor's appointment, something I confirmed almost by accident when I saw the appointment reminder still in her email. I felt ashamed of how far I'd let that assumption run before checking it. It taught me something I didn't fully appreciate until later: suspicion, once it takes root, doesn't discriminate between the true threads and the false ones. It just keeps pulling. The Sunday before Memorial Day, all 4 of us, Michelle, Kevin, Lisa and I, were at our place for a cookout, kids running through the sprinkler in the backyard, the smell of charcoal thick in the evening air. I stood at the grill with Kevin, the 2 of us falling into the same easy rhythm we'd had for 15 years, talking about nothing, and I remember looking at him, really looking, the way you look at someone you're trying to see clearly for the first time in a long time, and thinking, I don't know if I actually still know this man. Later that night, after Kevin and Lisa had left and the kids were in bed, I stood in the kitchen and watched Michelle through the window, out on the back porch, phone in hand, laughing at something on the screen, that same laugh I'd started to recognize as different from the one she used with me. I didn't go out there. I stood in the dark kitchen and watched my wife laugh at her phone on our own back porch, and something in me went very quiet in a way that felt less like anger and more like grief arriving early, ahead of the thing it was grieving. I didn't know it yet, but that laugh on the porch wasn't the last piece I'd need. The last piece was already sitting in a phone that wasn't mine, waiting for a mistake that hadn't happened yet. The mistake happened 4 days later, and it wasn't mine, and it wasn't even really Michelle's. It was Kevin's. He'd left his phone on our kitchen counter after dropping off Tyler's cleats, some mix-up with carpools that put him at our house for 2 minutes, just long enough to hand off a gym bag and leave again in a hurry. His phone buzzed while it sat there, screen lighting up with a photo preview from a messaging app, visible for exactly as long as it takes a person to glance down at a counter they're standing next to. It was a photo of Michelle. Not explicit, worse, somehow, in its intimacy. Michelle asleep, sunlight across her face, a shot taken from a pillow beside her, the kind of photo you only take of someone you've woken up next to. The caption beneath it, still visible in the preview, was 3 words long: missed this already. I stood there in my own kitchen holding a stranger's version of my wife's face on a screen that wasn't mine, and something in me that had been holding on for 2 months finally, completely, let go. Kevin came back in a moment later for his phone, laughing about something, already halfway through a sentence about the cleats, and he saw my face before he saw the screen, and I watched the exact instant he understood that I'd already seen everything he needed me not to see. I didn't know it yet, standing there with 15 years of friendship collapsing in real time in my own kitchen, that the conversation waiting for me that weekend wasn't going to be with Kevin at all. It was going to be with Michelle, and what she was about to tell me was going to be so much bigger, and so much older, than anything I'd spent the last 2 months preparing myself for. Kevin left without another word. I don't remember him saying anything, actually. I remember the door, and the sound of his truck pulling out of our driveway too fast, and then the particular silence of a house that still had 2 kids asleep upstairs who had no idea their entire world had just changed in the kitchen below them. Michelle came home an hour later from picking up groceries, and she knew the second she saw my face. I hadn't planned what I was going to say. I'd had 2 months to rehearse this moment in my head 100 different ways, and every version of it evaporated the second she walked through that door with a bag of groceries still in her hand. "Kevin left his phone here," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "I saw a photo." She set the bag down slowly on the counter, like her hands had stopped fully working. "Dan. How long?" She didn't answer right away. I watched something in her face go through about 4 different things at once: panic first, unmistakable, her eyes darting toward the stairs like she was checking whether the kids could hear, and then something that looked almost like relief, the specific, exhausted relief of someone finally being able to stop carrying something alone. "I need you to sit down," she said. "I don't want to sit down. I want you to answer the question. Dan, please." Her voice cracked on my name. "There's something you need to know, and it's not what you think, and I need you to actually hear all of it before you decide anything." Something in the way she said it stopped me cold, not the tone of someone caught in an affair bracing for the fallout, but something heavier, older, like she'd been standing at the edge of this conversation for years, not months. I sat down. I didn't want to. I did it anyway, because some part of me understood, even before she said another word, that whatever was coming was bigger than the photo on Kevin's phone. "It's not just this year," she said. "Kevin and I, before you and I got engaged. Before Tyler. There was a period, right after college, when things between you and me were rocky, when we'd taken that break, do you remember, junior year of the whole mess with your dad's illness and you pulling away from everyone?" "I remember," I said. My chest had gone very tight. "Kevin and I were together then. Just for a few months. It ended when you and I got back together, and I told myself it never mattered, that it was ancient history, something that happened before you and I were really us." She was crying now, but her voice stayed steady in a way that scared me more than if she'd fallen apart completely. "And then this year, it started again, and I told myself it was different, that it wasn't really the same thing happening twice, and I know now how insane that sounds." "That's not," I stopped, because something in her face told me she wasn't finished, and whatever was coming next was the part she'd actually been bracing to say. "Grace," she said. The room went very quiet. "Dan, I don't know," she said, and her voice finally broke apart completely. "I don't know for certain. There's a window, right before you and I got married, we'd had that one bad stretch, and Kevin and I, it was one time, one single time, and I told myself it didn't matter because you and I got married 3 weeks later and I never let myself do the math, I never let myself actually think about it, because I couldn't survive thinking about it." "Are you telling me Grace might not be mine?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence did it for her. "I want to tell you," I exploded. Some part of me expected to. What actually happened was smaller and stranger. One single, sharp sound came out of me, something between a laugh and something breaking, and then nothing. I sat very still at that kitchen table, hands flat on the wood, staring at a spot just past Michelle's shoulder, and I understood in that moment that the affair, the photo, the hotel charge, 2 months of collecting evidence like a man building a case, had just become the smallest part of what I was going to have to survive. She finally spoke again, after a long silence, and this is what she told me. "I have hated myself for 6 years, quietly, in a way I never let show on my face. Every time Grace laughed a certain way, every time someone said she had Kevin's chin instead of yours, I felt something in me go cold and I told myself I was imagining it, that I was punishing myself for nothing. I loved you. I want you to hear that clearly, because it's true even though I know it doesn't fix anything. I loved you and I built a whole life with you, and some tiny, cowardly part of me decided a long time ago that not knowing for certain meant I never had to actually face it. I let you love a little girl for 6 years without giving you the choice to ask the question I never had the courage to ask myself. That's the part one can't undo. Not the affair. This. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. I heard the refrigerator humming. I heard, faintly, Tyler shifting in his sleep upstairs, the old house settling the way it always did around 9 at night. "I need you to leave," I said finally. My voice had gone somewhere flat and very far away from myself. Tonight. I need you to pack a bag and go to your mother's, and I need you to do it right now, before the kids wake up. Dan, please, we can talk about this, we can figure out. There's nothing to figure out tonight. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't, and that surprised me more than anything else that had happened in the last hour. You've had 6 years to figure this out. I've had 40 minutes. I need you to go. She left a little after 10, quiet, no more pleading, like some part of her had understood the moment I stood up that this particular conversation was over, even if the larger one wasn't. I stood at the front window and watched her taillights disappear down our street, and I thought about Grace asleep upstairs, 6 years old, her whole face made of a question none of us had ever had the courage to ask. I didn't know it yet, standing in that dark living room with my whole life rearranged in the space of a single evening, that the DNA test I'd order within the week wasn't going to be the hardest part of what came next. The hardest part was going to be figuring out how to love a little girl through an answer I hadn't yet let myself imagine. The DNA test came back 9 days later. Grace was mine. I want to tell you that answer fixed something, and in the most important way, it did. Nothing about how I loved that little girl had ever been conditional, and it never would be, but I'd be lying if I said the relief that hit me in that clinic parking lot wasn't its own kind of collapse, different from the one 2 weeks earlier but just as total. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I could drive. What it didn't fix was anything else. Michelle and I tried, for about 3 weeks, to have the conversation that might have led somewhere other than where we ended up, a counselor's office, 2 chairs angled toward each other, Michelle reaching for words that never quite arrived at anything I could build back on. It wasn't the affair with Kevin, in the end, that made the decision for me. It was the 6 years. It was every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every version of my own daughter's face I'd have looked at differently if I'd known what Michelle had chosen not to tell me. I could imagine, eventually, forgiving an affair. I couldn't find my way to forgiving 6 years of a question she'd decided wasn't mine to ask. I filed in July. Michelle didn't contest much of anything. I think some part of her had already understood, standing in our kitchen that night, that there wasn't a version of this where I stayed. North Carolina courts don't always weigh infidelity heavily in asset division, but a documented 6-year concealment of a child's paternity, combined with the financial trail from Kevin's business account, moved the settlement conversation further than either of our lawyers expected. I kept the house. I got primary custody of both kids, with Michelle's visitation supervised for the first several months while the family court sorted through what, in the children's best interest, actually meant in a situation none of the standard paperwork anticipated. I kept far more of our joint savings than I'd walked in expecting to. Kevin's marriage ended within the same year, faster and messier than mine. Lisa found out everything, the photo, the years-old history, the paternity question, within a week of my confrontation with Michelle, delivered secondhand through a mutual friend before Kevin found the nerve to tell her himself. Lisa filed for divorce almost immediately, and Kevin's landscaping business, built for 15 years on local trust and neighborhood referrals in a town where everyone eventually hears everything, lost enough clients that by winter he'd sold half his equipment and taken a job managing crews for someone else. I heard, through channels I didn't go looking for, that he'd moved to Charlotte the following spring. I never spoke to him again. There's a moment from that October I keep coming back to, more than the courtroom, more than the last box of Michelle's things leaving the house. Grace, home from school, ran up to me in the driveway with a drawing she'd made, a family, stick figure simple, 4 people holding hands under a lopsided sun, and she'd labeled each one carefully in her wobbly 6-year-old handwriting, Daddy. Grace. Tyler. Mommy. She held it up and said, "This is us," completely certain, completely unaware of anything that had almost unmade that certainty just months earlier. I taped that drawing to the refrigerator, and it's still there. I wasn't the same man who'd sat frozen at that kitchen table in June, and I don't think I'd want to be. Something in me that used to let things go too easily, the calendar entry, the bread basket, 2 months of quietly gathering proof before I let myself act on any of it, had finally burned off completely, and what was left underneath it felt steadier, even in the middle of losing almost everything I thought my life was built on. I still see Lisa occasionally, at school events, both of us rebuilding something in parallel we never expected to be rebuilding. We don't talk about Kevin. We don't need to. I want to leave you with one more thing before I go, something I haven't said out loud until right now, telling you all this. That's my story. A calendar entry with the wrong name on it, a photo I wasn't meant to see, a little girl's drawing still taped to my refrigerator. I've had a long time to sit with all of it since, and a few things stayed with me. The bread basket taught me that the body knows before the mind is ready to. I felt something wrong at that dinner table months before I let myself act on it. Tyler's offhand comment about a headache that never happened taught me that kids are terrible liars but excellent witnesses, if you're willing to actually listen to what they say instead of what you expect to hear. And Michelle's 6 years of silence taught me something harder than either of those, that the lie you tell to protect yourself from a question is still a lie, even if you never technically speak it out loud. Have you ever found out that the ground you'd been standing on for years wasn't as solid as you thought, not because of one moment, but because of something someone chose not to tell you for far longer than that? Thank you for sitting with me through this one. If any part of it hit close to home, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. I read every one. See you in the next story.